Hi there, this is Colin McGarry's Walking D-Day. Today we're talking about the Ghost Army, which came into Normandy and with the Allies right into Germany. Now, many will have heard of Operation Fortitude, by which the Allies convinced the Germans that the invasion was going to be at Calais. And they did that by having a fake army in the southeast of England. What's less well known is the Ghost Army that came into Normandy and followed the Allies, or led them, right into Germany. Now, deception in warfare wasn't new. The Greeks used it to capture Troy, and Napoleon used deception. But it's never been carried out to such a great scale as in the World War II. In the War of Independence, Washington's troops were apparently trapped by the British, and he got some men to light bonfires and dig noisily. And so the British thought they were still there, and he moved his troops around to attack the British from another place. In the debacle of the Dardanelles in the First World War, the British managed to pull out under cover of a few men manning the positions, leading the Turks to believe they were still there. Dudley Clark pioneered deception during World War II by using fake trucks in the desert of North Africa to fool the enemy. Operation Fortitude South was built on his experience. Less well known than Operation Fortitude is the Ghost Army that went into Normandy and with the Allies into Germany. The Ghost Army was to be different to most military deceptions in that the men involved wouldn't become fighting men once the deception was over. They would move to start another scenario. The deception wasn't to be purely visual, but also sounds and radio. They would also need soldiers to guard the perimeter, so nobody could just wander in to see the fakery. A lot of people had suggestions on how to do this, but it was General Jake Devers who signed his name at the bottom. Devers was the top American commander in the European theatre. When Eisenhower replaced him in January 1944, he too embraced the idea. The new unit was called the 23rd Division Special Troops. It was activated in January 1944. The 23rd Division was made up of 4 sections, the largest being 603 Engineer Camouflage Battalion Special, with 379 men. Most of these men were artists and were to design and make fake tanks and trucks. The Signal Company Special consisted of 296 men, all experts in Morse and sending messages. They were to mimic the method of other operators who they would replace. The 3132 Signal Service Company Special had 145 men. They were to play sounds from huge loudspeakers to simulate construction of bridges or tanks and vehicles moving. The 406th Engineer Combat Company Special, these were trained as fighting soldiers. Their job was to guard the perimeter of the Ghost unit. They would also carry out construction and demolition. This division of around 1,000 men could simulate 2 divisions. That's 30,000 men. The unit came under the command of General Bradley, but the brains behind the deception were Billy Harris and Ralph Ingersoll. Their first commander was Colonel Harry Reeder. Many thought he was a bad choice, as he had a narrow, fixed idea of the military and didn't believe there was any value in deception, and thought the 23rd should be dissolved. The operations officer was completely different. Lieutenant Colonel Simonson threw himself into the task. There were no manuals, they had to improvise from scratch. After learning how to camouflage things at Fort Meade, they were sent to Camp Forest to learn how to draw attention to themselves. They had no decoys to work with, so they improvised, making tanks out of wood and canvas. The army finally went for inflatable models made by the US Rubber Company, who made inflatable life rafts for the Air Force. Goodyear also helped, along with smaller companies like the Scranton lace curtain manufacturer. The US Rubber Company stopped making barrage balloons to concentrate on tanks and trucks. Women would be hired on a Friday, train during the weekend, and be making tanks on Tuesday for 50 cents an hour. They were told they were making targets. A spotter planes went up to take aerial photos so they could see how effective their creations were. The tanks weren't just giant balloons. The skeleton was made of inflatable rubber tubes. The tanks and trucks had to be made in such a way that one piece of shrapnel didn't make the whole thing collapse into a shapeless blob. The signals men had another very special task. Of the first group, 40% were weeded out to be replaced with men from around the country. Sergeant Stanley Knox was on manoeuvres with the 11th Armoured. A stranger in a jeep rode up and said, "Get your things and come with me." When asked where they were going, the stranger said, "All I can tell you is that I can't tell anything and to shut up." Now with the other new recruits, they were told that their job was to pull enemy fire onto themselves. The Germans had few successful spies and got 75% of their intelligence from radio traffic. When the British captured the entire German radio intercept unit in North Africa, they were amazed to find how the Germans could pinpoint the location of a unit by its radio traffic. They could also recognise the style of a certain operator. If the ghost signal unit moved in to replace the unit moving out, the Germans would notice a change in style and might become suspicious. The ghost radio operators had to learn to mimic the style of those they were replacing, even their Morse code style. Some experts said that this was impossible, but they did it. Stanley Knox said he would study a radio operator for hours to learn his idiosyncrasies. The 406 was a security force. As one of the men put it, the only real soldiers in the unit. They had physical fitness and combat training at Camp Forest. Hundreds of miles north, the Sonic Deception Unit was training. Sonic deception had been first used by the Navy. Douglas Fairbanks, the actor, had joined the Navy. After observing the British commandos, he wanted to form a Navy deception team. In Italy, a beach jump party used these techniques. Small boats equipped with speakers would approach the beach, billowing out smoke and playing sounds of more vessels and men, while the real landing was elsewhere. The Army's Sonic Deception Unit was led by Hilton Howell Rayleigh. One of his first missions in the Army was creating the Why We Fight films to boost the morale of the new recruits.
The biggest bag yet. 185 enemy aircraft shot down. End of message.
Of the 500 German planes that came over that day, more than one-third were shot down.
In these 28 days, the Nazis lost 900 planes and their crews. The more they sent over, the more were shot down. The British Spitfire had proved to be one of the deadliest weapons ever put in the hands of man. If this kept up...
The mission of the Sonic Deception Unit was basically to simulate the sound of troops' movements and activity, especially at night when the enemy couldn't see that there was nothing happening. This is more difficult than it might seem. A trained observer knows the difference between different tank noises. The sound of a tank going uphill is not the same as going downhill. If a tank approaches a microphone and goes past and goes away, the Doppler effect changes the frequency. This would be a giveaway even to most people. To avoid this, the tanks went round in circles, keeping the same distance from the microphone. This was all carried out at Fort Knox using 18 Shermans and 200 infantry. Overflying was forbidden during the recordings to avoid the sound of planes being picked up. They also recorded trucks, bulldozers and building bridges. All these sounds were recorded on wire recorders. They could be replayed and mixed like an orchestra conductor. The speakers weighed 500 pounds and were mounted on half-tracks. One of the scientists developing this equipment was Leo Berenek. He developed the anechoic chamber to record sound with no echo. Berenek was one of the founders of Bolt, Berenek and Newman, now BBN Technologies. When broadcasting the sounds, the wind direction and speed, as well as the terrain and the distance to the enemy, had to be taken into account. After transferred to England, they were stationed at Walton Hall. Private Joe Spence was a late addition to the camouflage unit. He was walking up the lane towards Walton when he saw 4 men picking up a Sherman tank. Their first real practice deception was in the Thetford manoeuvre area. This was right near the Fortitude fake army, so adding more substance to Fusag. Now the 5th of June arrived, and the men knew that D-Day was on because they saw the sky full of airplanes going into Normandy. Now the first men of the Ghost Army arrived in Normandy on the 14th of June. They loaded some dummy artillery into a C-47 and they were heading to Normandy. Some of their fellow passengers were women. They were actually nurses coming to pick up wounded men and take them straight back to England. They landed at ALG 21 just above Omaha Beach. There were litters of wounded men by the runway, and even they saw an impaled cow stuck up in a tree. They could hear machine gun firing from not far away. Although they landed near Omaha Beach, their first mission was to support artillery near Ste Mere eglise. They set up their dummy artillery closer to the enemy than the real artillery. After inflating their dummy howitzers, they covered them with camouflage netting to make them look like real guns, visible to enemy spotters. Men of the 406 combat engineers had accompanied them. They set off flash canisters to simulate the guns firing. A photographer from Life approached. He couldn't understand why he couldn't come in to get some good photos of artillery in action. He went away angry. For a month they moved with the 980th as it advanced up the Cherbourg Peninsula. Their position was shelled many times, but they managed to escape having any casualties. During one move, Lieutenant Mason's jeep was behind a truck whose load seemed to wobble when it went over bumps. He realised it was a pile of German bodies. Now, most of the other ghost men arrived in Normandy on the 23rd of June. Now, whereas the first men had landed at Omaha Beach to go to Ste Mere eglise, the second group, they landed at Utah Beach and they came to Trevieres. During the night they set up their dummies. During the night a German plane came over and strafed the American positions. One of the men dived under a rubber truck as if it was a real one. In the morning, a French farmer, he just happened to pass by the perimeter guard, and he saw some of his cows pushing a tank around in the field. On another occasion, 2 young men on bikes had gone past the perimeter guard, and they saw 4 men lifting up a tank. The guard, he didn't know what to say. He said, "Oh, Americans are very strong." Their first mission was called Operation Elephant, and they were to replace the 2nd Armour Division as it moved out to new positions. They replaced every gun by a fake gun and every tank by a fake tank. The farmer was happy to see all the vehicles leaving, but surprised in the morning to see there were still tanks and guns on his farm. Operation Elephant was their first real test. There were difficulties in coordination with the other troops, and one problem was if there was a tank and no tracks to it, that wouldn't fool a pilot for long, and so they took turns with a bulldozer to make tracks going up to dummy tanks. A field gun had to have spent cases lying near it. In July, during the stalemate in Normandy, they had a lot of free time and spent a lot of that drawing the locals and local scenery. After the breakout of Cobra, Patton was into Brittany. The 23rd were now to convince the Germans that his main force was heading into Brittany while Patton was actually going east. They were split into 4 task forces, each representing a different combat team from a different division. The 35th, the 80th and the 90th Infantry and the 2nd Armoured. The attack on Brest was carried out by the 8th Corps, commanded by General Middleton. The 23rd were to inflate the apparent size of the American forces, hoping this would convince General Ramke to surrender. They were also to draw the German forces to the flanks, opening the way for an attack by the Americans in the centre. There were 3 task forces, 2 were tank battalions. The Sonic unit had arrived, so this was the first operation when they could use all means of deception. Sound trucks pulled up to within 500 yards of German lines, with noises of tanks pulling in and men setting up camp. The radio trucks were sending out messages that confirmed this. The trucks had explosives on them. If they risked being captured, the men were to destroy the trucks. More than 50 dummy tanks were set up during the night. Some real tanks were also present in the most visible positions. Laundry was hung up on lines, all part of the illusion. In the early hours of the morning, the men had to make sure the tanks were well inflated. They lost some air anyway, but during the cool night they would start sagging. The barrel was the first to sag. The men and vehicles had the 6 armoured insignia. They would drive into the nearest town. The GIs would be happy to see them. Heavy tanks, that's just what we need. One notional task force was to boost the 37th Field Artillery. The dummy guns were placed 600 to 800 yards in front of the real guns. Telephone lines were used to synchronise flashes of the fake guns when they're firing the real guns. During 3 nights, the fake positions received around 25 rounds of enemy fire. The real battery received none. Now the Germans moved between 20 to 50 88mm guns to counter the perceived threat of the tanks amassing. The effectiveness of their deception sometimes led to tragic results. Perhaps through lack of communication, General Middleton ordered a company of 709th Light Tanks to attack through a position where the 23rd had been mimicking a tank battalion. They had pulled in many 88s, which opened up on the light tanks, who thought they would be supported by the heavy tanks of the 6 armoured. The siege of Brest lasted till the 19th September. After capturing General Ramke, he said he believed the fake forces to be real, but that didn't push him to surrender because the Germans had twice as many men as the Americans thought they did. One unit they impersonated was the 80th Division. The men had 80th insignia on their uniforms and vehicles. Men with MP armbands went into bars in Rhine, in Brittany, and told all the soldiers in the bar that it was off limits. After visiting a dozen bars, everybody, including any spies, knew the 80th was in town. Impersonating a general is a court-martial offence, but sometimes they did that. Before Brest was liberated, the Allies were already into Luxembourg. The 23rd were now heading there. In a village just a few miles from the front line, 3 jeeps pulled up to a bar owned by a known German sympathiser. The middle jeep had the markings of a Major General. The insignia were of the 6th Armoured Division. The General and his aide, with their bodyguard, went into the bar and liberated 6 cases of wine before the convoy drove off. The owner was sure to tell the Germans the 6th Armoured were nearby. They had to mimic the habits of troops they were replacing. If the division sent a patrol out at dawn, they would do the same. If the division played softball, they would play softball. The 23rd also had to deceive their own side. Captain Reb was impersonating a full colonel when two officers who'd been a year ahead of him at West Point came into the fake HQ. They were surprised at his rapid promotion. They asked an orderly how he'd managed that. The orderly said, he was in the right place at the right time. Lieutenant Dick Syracuse ran into an old friend while he was supposed to be in the 83rd Infantry. His friend remembered that he'd seen him as the 5th Armoured Division and another unit before that. Syracuse confided that he was a bit of a screw-up and kept getting transferred. His friend said he should be careful, otherwise he'd be busted, and they put a rifle in his hand. Sergeant Jack Glynn was driving a jeep with the 90th markings on it and was stopped by a real 90th MP. This was the same time in the Battle of the Bulge when the Germans had been impersonating American troops. "What's the password?" asked the MP. "Don't know." "What was last month's password?" "Don't know. I've never had a password." "Where do you come from?" "Boston." "Boston's a big place." "Where in Boston?" "Medford." It turned out they lived about a mile from each other. They had what they called poop sheets on each division. This had details of insignia and other info on each division, even the way they made road signs. Corporal George Martin and another man were up a ladder measuring a road sign. A colonel from the division who put the sign up came along and asked what they were doing. "We're measuring the road sign." "Why?" "We're making sure it's conformed to army regulations." The colonel went into a fit about the goddamn army. "Don't they know there's a war on?" Martin and the other guy ignored him. Now Patton left Brittany in late August and sped across France to attack Metz. There was a 17-mile gap to the north, thinly held by the 3rd Cavalry Group. The Germans started to recover from the rapid exodus from France. If they realised how thin the resistance was, they could have surrounded Patton's forces. The 23rd were brought in to fill the gap, once again as the 6th Armoured Division, which was making its way eastwards. On the night of the 15th September, they arrived near Luxembourg town of Bittenburg. They weren't sure how close the front line was, perhaps 2 miles away. The Germans were the other side of the Moselle River. In the morning they set up 23 dummy tanks. With German aerial reconnaissance becoming rarer, sonic and radio deception were more important now. The sonic trucks operated for 4 nights. Lieutenant Syracuse was manning a guard post around the sonic trucks when the colonel from the 3rd Cavalry came up. "What's happening here? Nobody told me there are tanks here." Syracuse explained that there weren't really any tanks. "Don't tell me that, I can hear them." Apparently he'd missed the briefing when he would have been told what was happening. As he left, he said, "Well, you could have fooled me, son." During nights on guard duty, Syracuse would sometimes see tanks, even though he knew nothing was there. The men were briefed on the history of the 6th Armoured and would go into town and talk freely in bars. Sometimes they could see civilians taking photos of their jeeps and asking friendly questions. Their deception was only supposed to last for 2 days, but the 83rd, which was supposed to come in, was delayed. German troops were massing the other side of the river. Telephone lines were cut. Shots were heard in the surrounding woods. Even Patton was getting worried about this spot, but in the nick of time, the 83rd turned up to replace the 23rd. For the next few months, Luxembourg City became their base for their operations up and down the front line. Sergeant Spike Berry became a popular man with the troops, thanks to his ingenuity and having time on his hands. Watching films was a popular pastime for the troops. The 23rd, being an unknown unit, was low down on the list for getting films. One day in a film depot, he saw a bunch of projectors on a shelf. The soldier running the depot explained that they were dead because the exciter lamp was broken. The exciter lamp read the soundtrack. Beyer wrote to General Electric and a month later received a box of exciter lamps. They could now have the pick of the best films. Combat in the Hurtgen forest had been raging since September. The 23rd were to simulate the 75th Division moving into the south to pull some German troops from Hurtgen forest. Trucks with the 75th insignia drove through the villages northeast of Luxembourg. The sonic trucks made it seem there were 3 times as many. Phony command posts were set up. Colonel Reeder played General Prickett and visited these phony CPs. As the 75th was supposed to be new to the area, they had to listen with apparent interest as people told them about Luxembourg and the area. Lieutenant Colonel Fitz and Captain Reb went to near the river Sauer as if they were reconnoitring for possible crossing. Bullets started hitting the trees above them. A German patrol had crossed the river. As it would foul up their plans if they were taken prisoner, Reb ordered a retreat. The other side of the river wasn't so calm as they had thought. The Germans actually had plans of their own. The 23rd were just about to wrap up their first stage of the Operation Koblenz. They were expecting the arrival of a larger contingent for the second part. It was Sunday the 17th of December. Corporal Jarvie of the C Company 603rd was in Hoche, Luxembourg. Just after Mass they got news the Germans had broken through and were heading their way. They were told to pull out. This was Operation Wachstein Rhine, or Watch on the Rhine. It became the Battle of the Bulge. Nearby American units who couldn't pull out wondered why the 75th wasn't on their flank. Sergeant Berry, who fixed projectors with the exciter lamps, was just returning a film to a depot in a town not far from Luxembourg. All he saw was an MP. The MP said, "Get out of here." The town was Bastogne. When Luxembourg had been liberated, swastikas were taken down and US flags put up on houses. As the 23rd left the town, swastikas were going up again. Most of the men went eastwards. The radio men and some engineers of the 603rd were going south to help Patton again. This operation was codenamed Kodak because it was double exposure. They were to give the impression that 2 divisions were in 2 places at once. The Ghost 4th and the 80th Divisions were to be near the enemy, while the real divisions were sent north to relieve Bastogne. Major Ralph Ingersoll managed to get himself in the meeting in Verdun with Patton and Bradley. Patton was going to head north to Bastogne. Bradley was worried that his troops' movements would be difficult to disguise. Bradley asked Ingersoll if the Ghost Army could do anything. Ingersoll said, "Yes, we can," without knowing if they could. The radio operators faked the movements of 2 divisions going into reserve. The Germans could monitor all radio transmissions, but they wouldn't know which was the real division. Ingersoll is sure the operation was effective, as when Patton's troops arrived in Bastogne, the Germans were taken by surprise. By the end of January, the bulge had been reversed, and the Allies were advancing again. The 23rd were busy portraying the 90th, the 4th, and the 95th in quick succession. Private Ed Bio remembers that he hadn't washed for 43 days. They were too busy, and it was so cold. When they weren't moving for a mission, they were billeted in barracks in Briey, France, northeast of Metz. These artists had never stopped sketching and sometimes painting since they'd been in France. They made a gallery to show their work. This was a welcome distraction to the soldiers. Bill Blass was always interested in fashion. He would read Vogue in his foxhole. On one of his notebooks he drew the mirror images of bees, that became the logo of his fashion house. They suffered much fewer casualties than most units on the sharp end. In March 45, they'd been impersonating the 80th Division for 3 days, while the main attack was taking place further north. They were just moving out when shells came in. One landed in front of Sergeant Dowd's truck, then another went over hit the truck behind them. Sergeant Peddle was hit with shrapnel. One went to help him, but he said, "Don't bother, I'm going to die," which he did a few minutes later. Some men lost limbs, and Captain Thomas was killed when his jeep was caught in an artillery barrage. Harold Lehner was badly wounded by a chunk of shrapnel in his back. He was flown to Paris. Pablo Picasso came to visit the hospital and invited the artist to his studio when he recovered. One last barrier remained, that was crossing the Rhine. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would make the main thrust across the Rhine. 2 American divisions, the 30th and the 79th, would lead one wing of the attack on March the 24th. In Operation Wehrsen, the Ghost Army was to make the Germans believe that the 2 real divisions were going to attack 10 miles to the south. 1,100 men were to simulate 30,000 getting ready to charge across the Rhine. The real division radio operators went off air at a given time, and the ghost operators took over. Sergeant Knox transmitted 32 messages from 8 different locations. He had to match the power of his transmitter to the one he was replacing. There are no sophisticated measuring devices, so he used a pencil. Before the changeover, he would hold a pencil near the antenna of the real transmitter he was going to replace, and he would see how big the spark was. Then he would adjust his own transmitter accordingly. Camoufleurs set up a smoke screen over the Rhine as if to hide what they were doing. They made fake supply dumps and phony HQs. The Germans put up all the spotter planes they could to see what was happening. The 23rd set up more than 200 decoy vehicles a few miles from the river. The number was augmented by real vehicles. Some real anti-aircraft guns were supplemented by 80 dummy guns. Army divisions had a few spotter planes that could take off from a grassy field. The 23rd had a wooden aircraft laid out a runway. It was so convincing that a real observer plane landed on it. The pilot was told to get lost. The sonic trucks worked during the night and simulated trucks moving in. From near a lake, they blasted the sound of building as if they were practicing building bridges for the crossing of the Rhine. Some real sections were placed near the river. On the eve of the crossing, Churchill and Eisenhower joined Montgomery to witness the event. Tremendous pains had been put in place for the deception, but would it work? Early on the 24th of March, the real 30th and 79th Divisions started crossing the Rhine, expecting stiff opposition, but found very little, as if the Germans were expecting the attack elsewhere. 31 GIs were killed in the crossing. They could have had as many as that in a training exercise. Their last deception mission was a resounding success. With the war coming to an end, there were millions of displaced refugees in Europe. The 23rd found themselves guarding refugee camps. They also had to protect German civilians from marauding refugees. Now the veterans of the 23rd know they saved lives, but don't know how many. Some army reports say 15 or 30,000. German records show that some of the deceptions were taken hook, line and sinker. There are several ways you can support the channel. You can tap on like, subscribe, plus the bell, make comments, or even on Patreon.